Okay, so welcome all to this combined online session. This is our last opportunity to share ideas before we get together in New York. Tonight, Shona is gonna be with us for some minutes since she's at the airport, and we're gonna have um, brother Casey with us. He will speak a little bit about um, like ethical teaching within the Lasallian context and international partnerships. And then we will have Professor Dr. Plug. He will talk about media ecology and the nature of human perception. At the end, we'll have some time to share comments and ideas as a preparation for our meeting in New York. So I'm going to leave you with Brother Thomas.
Yeah. Good evening, buenas tardes. The rest will be in English. I am an alumnus of Manhattan College, so I'm very proud to know that my alma mater is engaged in this intercontinental educational venture. And I've had the opportunity to be a tourist in Bogota, and it's fun for me to reconnect with things Colombian as well. So I appreciate the invitation from Dr. Buchel to be part of the conversation this evening. This is an unexpected treat for me because I met Dr. Buchel when we were at an international Lasallian education conference in Mexico City just a couple of weeks ago. And she was speaking with me about the partnership between the two Lasallian universities, Manhattan College and Universidad La Salle. And I found it very exciting and very apropos to understand the connection that exists on our common home, as Pope Francis refers to our planet. And the fact that we can connect in this way, I think is mutually enriching. I've used the word Lasallian a couple of times already. It might merit some definition. Both Manhattan College and Universidad La Salle are Lasallian ministries. And that adjective is sourced in the name of John Baptiste de La Salle, a French priest who was born in the 17th century and who started a movement that continues into our own day here in the United States, also in Colombia, and about 80 other countries around the globe. So this conversation has the potential to really take off incredibly well if only we didn't have time zones that caused some people to be at a not an opportune time to have a college class. But John Baptiste de La Salle was subsequently recognized by the Catholic Church as the patron saint of teachers. He's the founder of the religious community in the Catholic Church to which I belong. The Brothers of the Christian Schools is our official title. And you can tell from that that we're in the business of education. And there are really 5 key principles associated with Lasallian education. Faith in the presence of God, concern for the poor and social justice, respect for all persons, inclusive community, and quality education. Let me say those again. 5 key principles associated with Lasallian education on the university level, on the secondary level, and on the elementary school level. Faith in the presence of God, concern for the poor and social justice, respect for all people, an inclusive community, and a quality education. So ethics, or a moral framework, if you will, has a significant role as a component of a quality education. And as we reflect on our ministry as educators, or as classroom teachers, or as creators of educational software, utilizers of technology to enhance education, whether that instructional design is in the classroom, where the students are physically present, and hence it might be much easier to be conscious of those 5 principles. Using the computer and various types of social media, there's a degree of remoteness and anonymity that enters the picture that is not part of the reality when you're in a classroom with living, breathing students in your midst. And I was saying to Dr. Buchel, I remember 30-something years ago when I was a fledgling math teacher, and they said, well, computers are coming into schools, math teachers should, it's numbers, zeros and ones, math teachers should be able to handle that. So I ended up learning a little bit about what to do about computers and education back in the early 1980s, the dark ages, when things were on magnetic tape, and worked very slowly if they worked at all. But I went to a workshop, and among the things that they said, the computer could be a tutor, but the computer can also be a tool. So for example, you can see right here, I have a tool. See this hammer? This tool can be used to build something up, to construct something, to create something, but it can also be used to take something down, to batter something into ruin. So if we think of the computer as a tool, like we think of the hammer as a tool, it has the potential to do good and build up, or it has the potential to do harm and tear down. So as an educator or a software designer with a Lasallian education, it requires, I believe, the educator or the educational software designer to be attentive to those 5 key principles, and especially concern for the poor and social justice, respect for all persons, and an inclusive community. And as you students go about your creative pursuits, I think it's really important to be attentive to those components of quality education that brands you as a Lasallian educator. So I would, again, appreciate any feedback or comments you might have about Lasallian education. And I think, Dr. Buchel, you said we might have opportunity after Dr. Blue does his presentation. Is that correct? I think.
Yeah, brother, that's the case. Yes.
Okay, so I've said what I think I need to say at this point, and would be happy to stay on the line and continue the conversation if desired later on.
Okay, thank you so much, brother.
You're welcome.
So I don't know if anybody has a question about the 5 principles within the Lasallian context that you would like to make now, or maybe we can listen to Professor Plug and then have a general questions about the 2 topics. If anybody wants to say something, please raise your hand or activate the microphone. If not, we'll move on to Professor Plug's presentation. Okay, so it seems, Professor Plug, now it's your turn to talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I have to say that before I begin, I think Brother Thomas sounds very much like a media ecologist, especially when he held up the hammer and talked about the potential to build and destroy. It's the kind of thing that we like to talk about. There's a very strong ethical component in media ecology scholarship. And I'll get to that in a minute, but I thought I'd try and at least give you a brief description of media ecology as a field, the kind of things that we're interested in, and maybe we can get into a little bit what the ethical profile of media ecology is before we're done here. It's in some ways, media ecology is kind of an unfortunate name. It's confusing. A lot of people will mail books to us to review about biology, not understanding that that's not exactly what we do, although the word ecology is in our title. Maybe some of you have heard of the Canadian scholar, a great Catholic scholar, as a matter of fact, Marshall McLuhan, and his famous axiom, the medium is the message. And McLuhan is one of the patron saints, I suppose, of media ecology, among a handful of others, for crystallizing, I think, and making clear a way of studying not the content of media, but the form. Through most of the 20th century, when people began to study media, they were turned on to the idea by, for example, the use of radio in World War I to propagandize various publics. And there was a great deal of fear among the public, for example, that radio would hypnotize us, that it was having a very strong effect on us. That gives a hint to the fact that people were concerned about what the form of media could potentially do. But we turned away from that very quickly and became concerned with content. And for the bulk of the 20th century, people began to study things like radio programming and films and television programming. And of course, it comes out of the tradition of studying literature and doing close readings of literature. McLuhan in the 1960s was commissioned to study media and the form of media, the form of information, and the type of influence it would have in order to create a program of education. People recognized that things were becoming increasingly complicated with mass media and with various forms of electronic media, and the need for media education sprang from that. And that's where he comes up with the medium is the message. It was a very quick and easy way to get people in the frame of mind that it's not the message, it's not the content that is primary. In fact, it's the form of the message that has the strongest influence. And it's not to say that human beings don't have agency, that people who watch a lot of television can't change their habits, for example, or can't buttress the effects of television by reading a lot of books. Is that people have plenty of agency in it, but awareness is key. And so when we talk about these things, we try to talk about information environments or symbolic environments. Where is your consciousness when you're reading a book? Where is your consciousness when you're watching television? And then in doing that, we start to tune into human perception and the effects of technology on our psychology. How are we cognitively different? How are we psychologically different than people who didn't have computers, who didn't have the internet? I think it's probably quite natural for people to think, and it sounds like common sense, that people who engage with computer screens and with social media and with mobile technology a lot are somehow psychologically or even cognitively different than people who didn't. And so the psychological end of it is interesting. We want to talk about how were people different in oral cultures and oral societies prior to literacy. How did alphabetic literacy change us psychologically? What does it mean to be literate? You can't undo literacy unless you have some sort of traumatic brain injury, for example. There is an effect, and the nature of the effect is not particularly well known. So we do emphasize perception, cognition, psychology, and the individual. But we also are interested in social arrangements and the way that technologies, media create environments in which we socialize with one another. The media that we interact with aren't simply tools. They become environmental. We cease to recognize that they exist. When we're on a computer, we don't necessarily think, while we're talking to each other right now, as a matter of fact, we don't think about all the software. We don't think about the keyboard necessarily. We don't think about having headphones in. It's a holistic experience that we're engaged with. And it does have some effect on how we're being in the moment as individuals, but it also has an effect on how we're able to communicate with one another. And so, for example, when Brother Thomas took out the hammer, he touched on something very interesting in that this Zoom software, this platform on top of the internet, which is on top of servers and a whole host of other things, gives us this wonderful possibility to connect with one another across great distances, and not only by telephone, but face-to-face. There's something much more personal and intimate about this experience than a speakerphone in a conference room. But we also need to think about the drawbacks of these things. For example, there's a lot of concern about social relations in this era, where we're connecting from halfway across the world in some cases, but we're not very good at connecting with people who are sitting in the room next door. This is the idea that you can be in the same room together on the sofa, but you're all on your phones texting. And so these are the kind of concerns that we have. And I think you can hear that when we proceed from that way of thinking, that we talk about a sort of a Faustian bargain. The Faustus and the parable of Faustus and the deal with the devil, we get something wonderful that we learn to hold up and admire and cheer for and celebrate, but we aren't quite as good at recognizing the negative consequences of these things that we adopt into our lives. And so every new technology presents us with a Faustian bargain. We gain some wonderful new thing, but it's likely that we lose a handful of other things that were wonderful as well. And so for media ecologists, we're interested from the point of view of education, we're interested in creating awareness of that Faustian bargain. It's a phrase that was connected to the way we think by a man by the name of Neil Postman from New York University. And maybe you may have heard of the book Amusing Ourselves to Death, that he wrote in about 1986 about television and its impact. I recommend that. Postman was a wonderful scholar, and he's easy to read. And I think if you want to learn more about this kind of thinking, he had a very strong ethical character to his work, and he's very clear. I could go on and on about this, obviously, but I'd like to entertain questions that you might have. And if I pose a question out loud to you, feel free to use that to interact. But if you have other questions that you'd like to ask, certainly anything is fair game. I'm curious if you can parse out from what I've said what media ecology and this perspective has to do with ethics, maybe beyond the Faustian bargain that I described.
Thank you, Professor Plug. Yes, the idea is then for our students to ask questions. Either you can also make comments if you want on what was just presented by Professor Plug, or to answer this connection between media ecology and ethics in instructional design. So who wants to start, or should I call names as Professor Sona does? No? Okay, everybody seems to be shy tonight. Anita, Laura, Billy, Bobby.
So media ecology is kind of like the evolution of media, and when it was, you kind of walked us through the inception to where it's come now. That's kind of my summation. Am I correct in that?
Well, there's definitely a strong historical sense. There's a lot of large questions. I mean, I think those big questions are wonderful, and certainly we've become good as scholars at using the microscope to look at important details. But those big questions, those questions like what does it mean to be human, we tackle those things, I think, largely through understanding this long historical arc. For example, how societies were organized and what kind of human beings we were prior to having literacy, and what happens when we begin to adopt writing systems, and how are societies organized differently? How is power reflected in that arrangement? Who is privileged and who's not? What are the biases of these forms of communication, and who do they privilege, and who's marginalized by them? Looking at that sort of long arc of history, that's certainly a part of what we do. Yeah. Yeah.
Great.
Thank you, Anita, for your question. Anybody else? Curly, please go.
Hi. It's not necessarily a question. It's more of a comment. Oh, sorry. Because being that we are in a Lasallian school and thinking about our present mind when we are creating any technology or conducting classes, I think it does help to have that Lasallian value in your mind when you're presenting or even when you're creating, because it does fall into your own value set. And I think what we want to do is be able to project that values out. And regardless of what the topic is, we are still teaching, and we always want to be able to bring out that Lasallian value. And having been raised in a religious home, and I've also been in elementary school, and having that reinforcement of religion and prayer and practice, it does, without you consciously knowing it, your actions speak louder than words. And so I think it's wonderful that we're in this school and that we are part of this same values, so that when we do go out and teach and create, we are, hopefully projecting the same Lasallian values that we're sharing together while we're collaborating. So it was just a comment, not necessarily.
Yeah, no, it's a good comment. It's a good comment. It's a good comment. Thank you. I think one of the things that, this connects to sort of what I was saying prior to the Q&A. We're very good at being conscious of the content that we produce, what we say to students, for example, what we say to one another, what we have them read, and what videos we have them watch, and these kind of things. We're very good at that. I mean, we pay a lot of attention to that. And I find that people are not necessarily always as conscious about the form of the communication, the form of the information. Is what are we asking students to do when we're asking them to read? What are we asking students to do when we're asking them to participate in a conversation in a room, either with one another or at a distance like this, sort of a virtual room? What are we doing when we show students a PowerPoint versus writing the exact same information on the board with a marker or a piece of chalk? What's the difference in that experience, and how does that experience impact the student as a person? How does it impact the students collectively as a social group? And when you bring up the idea of Lasallian values, I think it's important to consider when we create new technologies and when we design using those technologies, we are programming our values into the curriculum or into the communication that we're engaged in a way that we're not always very aware of. We're not tuned into that particularly. As I said, we're very good at being in tune with what we're programming into the content that we're sharing or that we're asking students to experience. But I think it's a much more difficult task, but a crucial task to say, what values are we suggesting are important to this experience when we ask them to do these various information-related tasks?
Very interesting, Dr. Plug. And I have a question about it. I am not an expert in media ecology, but something that we have been discussing throughout our course, it's how to get us to realize about our set of beliefs and values and how they impact what we do in classes. I would like to know if you can tell us a little bit about how should teachers go about this process of becoming aware or conscious of their beliefs and the impact and their values, the beliefs, and the impact those values and beliefs have in the technology they use, in the kind of activities and the contents they might be more inclined to favor?
I think the first thing is individually we have to become much more aware of our own habits. much more aware of the impacts that, I don't spell nearly as well as I used to. Growing up as a child and as a teen and as a young adult, I was an expert speller, for example. I was proud of my ability to spell a whole variety of words. And because we have this crutch now where we have, autocorrect on our phones, we have it in all the online services we use, we have squiggly lines under the words that we write in Word and other sorts of software, we start to get slightly lazy. And likewise, I think I can attribute some of this to getting older. I turned 48 the other day, and gradually over the last several years, I don't remember names offhand as easily as I used to, and I sort of lose some of those things, and they come back to me later in a different way than years ago. But I also think that our memories are not nearly as good as they once were. We read in short bursts. We watch lots of video. If we get confused about something or we need information and we can't remember, we have Google at our disposal. We don't exercise our brains in a way that has a real, we talk about neuroplasticity, for example. We talk about the way that the brain builds neural connections. And, the mapping of the brain they've done in recent years has suggested that people who read voraciously, book reading, who read voraciously have a very sophisticated set of synapses, where people who do other sorts of tasks and online tasks have a very different kind of map. And it's not to suggest that one is inferior or superior to the other, but we definitely can say one is superior for a certain set of tasks and values and so forth than another. One is inferior for those kind of tasks. And we're in this sort of odd conundrum now where most of the institutions and the large scale institutions that we have operate on old software, as they say. They operate on a software built out of a period of hyperliteracy where people were readers and so forth. The tasks that we performed in these kinds of work were all very literate, lots of alphanumeric tasks and so forth. And increasingly, we're very imagistic in our daily information habits. So to answer the question, I think we have to become aware of what's happened to ourselves as individuals before, and then sort of expand that to think about what's happened to students as well. It's happening to all of us. And I hesitate whenever somebody starts to wag a finger at those young people who have their heads buried in their phones, because I see people of all ages with their heads buried in their phones. I do it too. I think we have to become aware of that first. And in doing so, we can then start to turn our attention to what is it that I'm asking students to do? Am I asking students to do something I'm no longer comfortable doing? Am I asking students to do something that they couldn't possibly be comfortable doing because they're not anchored in a period prior to the computers and the internet, for example? Once we begin to do that, I think we can start to understand which part of the curriculum that we're giving students is medicine and which is vitamins, which is a corrective. When we have students read difficult and complex things, there's something corrective in the form rather than the content. There's something that gives them the opportunity to build those synapses and do exercise, where the vitamins are more, here's what you're already good at, and let's enhance that by doing it well, and creating a balance. But we have to be in tune with ourselves first, I think, and be honest with ourselves.
Could I just go back to the Faustian bargain and point out that Goethe's protagonist was an individual who struck the deal with Mephistopheles.
Yes.
And I think where I find myself, and I think what you were saying as well, is as a society, somebody has made this bargain for us, and we are somehow complicit and maybe not even aware of the insidiousness that is lurking. And the challenge, I think, for us as educated people is to be attentive to the underlying premises and not allowing ourselves to be unduly manipulated through the cultural constructs that surround us that maybe we don't reflect on with the depth that would be advantageous.
I think that's exactly it. And people who are wiser than me have talked about this issue in terms of, you can do a number of different things to unplug or disconnect or, delete your Facebook or, text, after a certain hour, and don't look at your email. There's a lot of things individually we can do, but it doesn't change the fact that unless everyone stops doing them simultaneously, unless there's a broad cultural change, the impact is negligible. And actually, as an individual, you become an outcast. You marginalize yourself in the process. It's not so simple. So the Faustian bargain is definitely, we are making these individual choices, but on the other hand, they're so alluring. And what other choices do we have? I think that's an important thing to recognize. And I think that's the challenge to educators. I think that's the ethical challenge to educators. I can talk about all these things and what I think we need to do in sort of programming our curricula and keeping form in mind as we, design these things. Like, are we doing it because students like that kind of thing, or because it's easier to show a video, they don't want to read, and these kind of things? And certainly there's temptation in all those things. But we have to respect people's intelligence, and we have to respect people's willingness to take on more difficult tasks, understanding that just because there are easier choices, that those choices aren't necessarily healthy choices. We talk about this in terms of food all the time, right? It's like, I definitely want to go down the street and buy like some junk food down the street, and I will sometimes. But if someone explains to me the damage that will do to my body and the way that I can counteract that damage through healthier choices, I'm going to make those healthier choices. But if we just say you have to read because you're not good students if you don't read, for example, no one responds well to that. Children don't respond well to that, and certainly adults who respect their own intelligence and their own integrity don't respond to that. But if we explain to them the Faustian bargain, if we explain to them, the real sort of cognitive, psychological, and social effects of giving up some of these things because they're difficult and challenging, I think we're not doing right by people. And I do think that they'd be willing to choose that fresh choice that will be better for them in the long run.
Thank you, Professor Plug. I would like to ask any of the students to see if they want to make a comment or ask a question based on what we just heard. Okay, Laura, right?
Hi. Yes. I've been writing down all these books and stuff. I'm really interested in media. But I'm wondering, in terms of, you're talking about how students are different now and how they grew up with the internet and all this stuff.
Yeah.
How much of that do you think is individual, like a learning style, and how much of it is just based on the fact that, they grew up with phones in their hands and we're on our phone all the time?
I think it's a great question. And I don't know there's an easy way to answer that. I don't think I can answer that, and I'm not sure that many people can effectively answer that. It's complex. When media ecologists, the ecology part of it is because we're interested in systems theory, and systems theory teaches us that there's complexity in biological niches, for example, and there's a complexity that you don't add a predatory species into a pond and it's the same pond plus the predatory species. Everything about the ecosystem changes, and that's sort of where we are. There's going to be individual learning styles. There always have been. And so when you add a new technology into this environment where there is a sort of pre-existing condition, we have different learning styles. We're wired differently. We have different life experiences. We're culturally different. It's not necessarily going to have a universal effect. However, I think when we talk about the most significant technological changes, the biases of these media are so strong that it's unlikely they'll have no effect. Even if the effect varies to some degree, they tend to have very large scale effects. And I could go on about this forever. I'll just give you one quick example. We introduce electricity into the world, sort of broadly, 100, 125 years ago. And it had a profound effect on individuals, on societies, and not everyone is going to respond sort of psychologically to these experiences the same way of hearing things on the radio or talking to someone on the telephone. Is that there will be different psychological profiles for those experiences, but it's undeniable that everyone will be experiencing communication at great distance where geography and time have been collapsed, right? Electricity had that huge, profound effect. And so whatever variations exist sort of at the individual level, it's it's true that they have huge culture-wide, society-wide, global kind of effects, these major technologies anyway. And so I think we need to study both. I don't think that there's any way that we could study one and say that's the only way to study it. I think, it's the reason that we want to have a program of study that recognizes the more micro level issues in pedagogy, for example, and then the macro level. What is it that we're calling education now, for example? Did that answer any part of your question? Okay.
Okay, thank you. I don't know if anybody else wants to ask or make a comment. No, not yet. Okay, the idea is for this to be a dialogue, guys. I have a question, and it has to do with human communication precisely in terms of how has it. You mentioned before an interesting example of how we have evolved from oral societies into literate societies, and I wonder how how human communication and interaction has evolved thanks to technology, and if whether or not we teachers are helping with that evolution, or should we help? Should we say no, remember this and that? We should also read print books. I mean, what is our role? That's probably what I'm trying to ask. What is our role as educators in this evolution that human communication is having thanks to technology?
Yeah, that's a good question.
I'd like to, if I could, just cite two other books of Neil Postman's, which are favorites of mine.
Yes.
Which he wrote in the late 60s, teaching as a subversive activity. And then about a decade later, he wrote another book, teaching as a conserving activity. And I think those of us who are in the Ministry of Education straddle those two polarities, that we're called on to be conservers, and at the same time we're called on to ignite new things and be subversive. And it's the walking the tightrope, and the fun of the job is knowing how to balance the two pieces. So I don't think we throw everything out, but I don't think we canonize everything and shut out any new potential either.
It warms my heart to hear you bring up those books. I'm Postman's student's student. I'm like the intellectual grandson of that tradition, and I'm in the early stages of working on a book that I think connects subversive and conserving. I'm writing a book that's tentatively titled "Teaching as a Humanizing Activity," and Postman's idea was a thermostatic view. He believed that education played a thermostatic view in our culture, that if a culture became too unbalanced in one way, the job of education was to provide students with something to pull them back in the other direction. And so if we are a people who are culturally predisposed to immediacy, instant gratification, short bursts of information, imagistic content, and so forth, that the role of education was to get students to do things that fostered and grew long attention spans, deep and complex thinking, discipline. He liked to use the word rigor, that we're no longer capable of rigor in the way that previous generations were. And the first book, written in the 1960s, Teaching as a Subversive Activity, was saying that if a culture is moving too slowly, that things are slow to change institutionally in particular, where schools are old and stodgy and don't keep up with the sensibilities and the needs of people, that those schools need to be radically changed. And that turned on a lot of people, certainly at that period of time. The thermostatic view recognizes that wherever we are in our culture, education can serve as sort of can restore equilibrium to culture. And now it's certainly open to debate as to what the nature of that equilibrium is. I don't think it's fair to suggest there's one sort of thing, but Postman was very much an Enlightenment scholar, and believed that the respect for human dignity and for the respect for the autonomous individual came directly out of our shift to print literacy through the Protestant Reformation and through the printing press establishing mass education, democratizing information so that everyone had access to the same brilliant scholarship and so forth. I think, it's open to some debate as to whether or not that way of thinking is the only way of thinking about equilibrium. Certainly we have differences of opinion about certainly some people were privileged and some people were marginalized in that arrangement. And now we've been able to really radically change the world as a result of our electronic communication. And we don't want to throw that out. So it's up to us as educators, I think, primarily to understand the nature of information environments, how they program us psychologically and socially, and then design curricula and learning environments, not only the curricula, but the environment itself in a way that promotes some sort of equilibrium, preserving what was wonderful and beautiful and necessary from prior information environments, while also effectively using the current information environments to keep us moving forward, I suppose.
And I think there's a curious link with John Baptist de La Salle.
Absolutely.
Because in 1680, the France of Louis XIV, he came to realize that the children of the working class and the poor, the male children, that is, of the working class and the poor, were not being educated and were therefore being held back. And he saw the power in education, and what he and his early followers did was to provide free education for those young kids so that the playing field could maybe get a little bit more level. And, we talk about a digital divide now, but in the France of Louis XIV, there was a big divide as well in terms of who was educated and who wasn't. And if you didn't educate them, then they stayed wherever you wanted them to be, namely your servants.
Yeah, I think if I had to show my own bias about what sort of equilibrium I prefer, drawing from our contemporary life and drawing from the example of De La Salle, is it's inescapable that literacy is still the key that unlocks the door to power in our society, regardless of the fact that through electronic technology, through networked communication and so forth, we've been able to knock down a lot of the hierarchical parts of our society. We see them crumbling before our eyes, as both with intent from the ground up and from negligence from the top down. Is that those at the top who are now using electronic communication and networked communication are doing it in a negligent way, where it crumbles some of the moral fiber of society, the respect that we have for one another, the careful concern of thoughtful, human-centered communication. We see that from the top down, and from the bottom up. I mean, we do see the ability to sort of kick down doors that were put up in front of us, to break down walls, to use that expression, I guess, at this moment. But the character of our information environment now, because of the nature of electronic social communication, is highly emotional, which is wonderful. It activates people. It gets people fired up. They go take action where normally they may be just sitting on their hands. We're good at activating people nowadays. We're very good at it, as a matter of fact, and it's had great and wonderful effect for people at the grassroots level. People have been able to challenge people in positions of power in a way that we haven't seen in a very long time. But there is always a danger that if you have a mass of people who are activated and who are seeking power, who are using their voices and emerging from the margins to claim power, there's a danger that that group of people could become an angry mob. We talked about this in the 1920s when Walter Lippmann wrote Public Opinion. He was concerned that democracy is a wonderful thing, but what if people are not so thoughtful? What if people are more emotional? And this was at a period of time where we didn't know anything about any of these electronic forms of communication and the impact they would have on us broadly. And now that we do know that, it's one of the reasons why I think the equilibrium comes from this wonderful new positive thing that we have that has a very negative potential outcome in that Faustian sense. And to avoid the negative outcome where we become an angry mob, where the turn to fascism, for example, from the top creates a counter movement of violence from the bottom, literacy can be the thing that saves us all. And literacy is hard. And so people feel much more satisfaction from the ground up, screaming at the top of their lungs. It feels good. I do it all the time online, right? I'm not immune to it any more than anyone else. But to create sustainable, thoughtful, and reflective human-centered communication, we need to be trained to do that. And it happens both through face-to-face communication, through helping people engage in more effective dialogue, and also through teaching people patience and rigor and discipline in their thinking that can really only come from that hard work that we call reading.
That's very interesting, Professor Polak. We have been discussing in our course about the digital divide, and I think this is connected to what you just said. I would like to talk a little bit about it, because it seems to me that whenever we speak about technology and human interaction and communication nowadays, we assume that all of us have the same access, and that all of us understand or have the same ideas about what technology is and how to implement it, etc. And with this topic of digital divide, it seems what calls my attention is we teachers become more aware and more conscious of certain things that we can do to make sure that our students are also aware of social injustice, and how to come up with ways to balance communication and the use of technology. But I would like to for you to share with us what you think about digital divide and media ecology.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm really only speaking for myself here. I think that there's probably a variety of opinions about what to do about the digital divide among media ecologists. And personally, I think one of the big issues is it's a much bigger issue than the digital divide. It's an issue of a fairer distribution of the resources of our societies, so that more people can benefit from them. And if we believe in democracy, people fight for issues like net neutrality and the digital divide and other things. We can't live in the broader globalized connected society with all of the sort of fruits of that development and all of the things that have become required in that environment if we don't have access to sort of a fairer distribution of wealth and resource. And I think that's the fundamental fight of the 21st century. It begins with an epistemological and an ontological kind of concern. What is the nature of being human is important, and also how do we know what the good life is? How do we know what it feels like to be powerful, for example? I think people are beginning to ask those questions more broadly. I think solving the problems of the digital divide certainly are related to that issue, but in some ways I think that that's like putting a Band-Aid on something that needs open heart surgery. Now, given that it is a real problem and that we do have to address it, I think the first thing that we can do, as in any case where there's privilege, is if we are people who are connected, if we are people who have these tools at our disposal and the privileges that go with them, we have to figure out a way to share those tools and share those privileges with people who don't yet have access to them. As educators, certainly, working within the framework of existing institutions, we can fight for those resources, and we can fight to build those programs and find homes for those sorts of programs in institutions with Lassallean values and with other sorts of similar values as well. But I think it begins with a mission that is much more broadly connected to Lassallean values, and that's social justice. We have to be about social justice and creating social justice across the board in any place that we interact. But certainly in this case, we have the power as educators who hopefully have some institutional support in these things to raise up the voices of people who have been voiceless or at the margins and get them access to these environments that are so crucial.
I like the emphasis on the social justice, and I think there's a nuance to it that I worked for 14 years, most recently in a small middle school on Long Island for kids from lower socioeconomic classes. And a lot of them had, as probably most of us do, some kind of smartphone. So we said, oh, good, they're connected, they're tied in with technology. But if you gave them a homework assignment to go read something or research something on a website, they're going to be reading it on a teeny tiny screen. And if you ask them, type or print out what you found and bring me a hard copy, they don't have access to a printer.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that dimension of it. I think that it's not quite as obvious, but it's equally as real, at least in that part of the United States where I was serving.
Yeah.
The other part of it is because everybody has this, we think everybody knows how to use it the way we college graduates or soon to be college graduates or master's degree people or doctorate people use it. And the kids who have it then know how to play games with it.
Mm-hmm.
But they don't know how to research anything. They don't know how to use it as a way to enhance their knowledge base or to solve problems. And that's, I think, a nuance to the digital divide that can easily be eclipsed by the visual of seeing these in everybody's hand.
We do have the problem, thanks, I have to plug my computer in. We do have the problem of information glut in addition to an information scarcity in this case. The digital divide produces an imbalance in our information resources, and certainly information scarcity is the result of that. Most of human history, we've been plagued with information scarcity. Not enough information to heal ourselves, not enough information to make peace with others, and not enough information to communicate with others. And we solved that spectacularly, but one of the things that's happened is the reverse of that. And information glut is, I have a phone now. I can access information. I no longer am plagued necessarily by the same information scarcity I would have been otherwise, although it may be more difficult for me to access information than others who have more resources. But what to do with that information and how to understand which information is valuable and which information is garbage, for example, or which information is useful to me, or how to understand competing viewpoints when there are potentially thousands of them around the same issue. That's an issue of ethics in education as well. I would say that I guess information as a human right is a conversation that I think we're in the middle of having right now. We talk about healthcare as a human right and a variety of other things as human rights. And we live in an age where is it feasible to expect that people who are subjected to the information scarcity that marked past eras of human history in this era of information abundance are living their fullest potential, and therefore is it right for us to say that information is now a human right? That conversation is going on, and I think it's at least a good question to entertain. Is information a human right?
That's a very interesting thing to discuss, and I would like our students to join this moment of the conversation to share with us what they think about what we have been discussing so far. I would also like to mention something that is happening in Colombia, and it's the use of cell phones in schools. If you know, the use of cell phones in France was prohibited, so the students and teachers are not supposed to use them. Something very similar is going on with our country right now. And that has generated a lot of controversy because it seems that teachers, parents, and I don't know, I'm not so sure students think like that, but it seems teachers and students are concerned with the amount of information students are receiving. But more than that, it's what students are capable of doing with that information, whether or not we are, carefully like keeping track of what they are doing with cell phones and with information that we receive, et cetera, et cetera. And probably when you were talking, Professor Plug, I was thinking about media literacy. It seems to me that nowadays every single teacher, every single educator has to become involved with media literacy. So, but before we talk about this, I would like any of our students to share their comments or their questions. Billy, you made a very interesting comment about the use of video games. I don't know if you want to share that with us now.
No, I'm good. Thank you, though.
Okay. Anybody else? I don't know if David or some students of ours in Colombia, Laura, Alba, Alejandra. No, well, it seems that we have been very clear.
Well, I do have
I will make a comment.
Okay, David,
Oh, okay.
David, please go ahead.
Oh, sorry, we just spoke at the same time. If you want to go ahead, go right ahead.
No, please go ahead.
I just had a quick question about it's a very thorny issue about information being a human right.
Yeah, it is.
But I was very curious about like what your view is on that specifically. You know, having the background that you have, and from a postmodern viewpoint, like how does like the right to proprietary content fit into that, privacy, those and things like this? Just from your point of view, I'd like to get your insight.
I would lean in the direction of saying certainly education is a human right. I don't think that's a particularly controversial thing.
No, I agree with that. But information being a human right is completely disparate from education being a human right.
Absolutely.
Because education is a process, information is a thing.
Yes. I think the term information can get muddied a bit, but I would say that when we talk about information as a human right, I think it's connected. The definition of information in the case of information as a human right is connected largely to the idea of two things. One of them is education, and one of them is the sort of enlightenment value of an informed public being able to make autonomous decisions as the root of one person, one vote. And it's certainly the people who talk about information as a human right, I think, are probably talking about it in a direct straight line from that enlightenment idea and connecting it to things like economic justice and other things, and arguing that without access to information, how can a person be expected to equally and fully participate in our economic environment, and more and more.
In that respect, how would you define information?
Well,
because if we're making arguments, we should make definitions of the base things first, right?
Yeah,
so in order to have the debate or the conversation, we'd have to make a definition of what it is we're talking about, which is information. So if it is thorny, then the debate kind of loses validity.
Well, I mean, it's also, I mean, if we're talking about the limitations of technology, we are talking about the mechanical clock here, and the difficulty. I mean, this is a subject that certainly could take place over the course of a number of classes and over the course of a number of weeks. But I think maybe suffice it to say that access to information is directly connected to the support for institutions that provide the public with said access, like things like public libraries. Things like public education, because you don't have public education without knowledgeable people, without certainly supporting libraries or supporting resources of those sorts. And then, I think one of the thornier parts of it is when we start talking about access to the internet in particular. When we start talking about net neutrality, when we start talking about, solving the problem of the digital divide by creating community broadband and other similar programs. And so, from my point of view, I'm always likely to align with greater access to these resources through public investment. But I recognize that's controversial. That's just one way of thinking about things. And certainly that doesn't happen without lots of problems and lots of complications and expenditures and so forth. But I lean in that direction, is that if we, I'm very much sort of a John Dewey scholar in this sense. If we believe that societies are organized as publics around values and needs and claims against situation X, Y, or Z, and we create institutions in order to support our values and our claims and our needs, that in this day and age, one of the most important needs is the need to access the same wells of information or pathways to information across the board. I think, print democratized information in that way. The internet has democratized information in that way. Public libraries were designed to solve the problem of democratizing access to print information. And I think things like community broadband and other sorts of things, other sorts of programs are probably a way.
Sorry to interrupt you, but I'm just really curious before I lose my thought.
No, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I'm in Puerto Rico and I'm very distracted right now.
Yeah, cool.
I was curious about what your views on regulating information is, because there's a lot of harmful information.
Oh, I see. And you were talking about proprietary.
Those kind of things that might, it's all about access to information to inform a public in order to vote that will affect them. How do we effectively regulate information that might be harmful to them? Don't have a workforce to vet it in the public interest. I don't know.
I don't know either.
I would defer to your expertise on that.
No, I don't have any expertise. I mean, I wish I had expertise in that. I wish I had something intelligent to say on the subject. I mean, I think, the Creative Commons and treating information as a commons is sort of it's a very libertarian point of view, and it's certainly the point of view that's espoused by people like Lawrence Lessig at Harvard, I believe, where we create ways to share information while still preserving some rights to that information. I don't know. I mean, I think this is an example of where media ecologists would say sometimes technologies and their capacities outpace the ability of old institutions to handle them. And so what you have to do in those cases is those old institutions become obsolete and new institutions take their place. And I don't know what new institution would emerge from this situation, because emergence is a highly unpredictable part of systems theory. But suffice it to say that we may be at this crossroads, sort of sociological crossroads about how our societies are organized and what institutions will support that organization, and that we see some things fall down before we pick them up and something new emerges. So I don't know the answer, except I expect human beings, through either by accident or by intent, will design something new to handle that situation.
Yeah, I think I agree with the idea of deconstruction for finding a new model that can fit new technology that constantly surpasses what we can handle, because we have such a slow rate of building infrastructure to fit it.
Yeah.
And Moore's law is just, it just surpasses like the way that we can think anyway. So we end up using it for more kind of like sophomoric and shallow, superficial things, that increase dopamine. Instead of like deep learning and thinking. Thank you very much for answering.
Thank you. Good questions.
Okay, Dina, I think you wanted to ask something.
Yes, well, my question was similar. Is as we're giving more, as information is becoming more accessible, as an educator, I do worry about critical thinking skills and problem solving skills that this young group of children coming in are lacking. And as an example for myself, I drive somewhere, I put my GPS on. I don't have to figure out or pay attention or take in landmarks, and I can drive somewhere for 5 times and not remember it the 6th. And so I do worry about those pieces of, how to problem solve on your own instead of just Googling the answer, or how to really think about things, because batteries do die and programs change. And sometimes, who's to say that Google's going to be around in 5-10 years? Something else might come out. Google's a new concept, and I wonder what your take on that is.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an interesting thing that I bring up in classes sometimes about this. let's say we all have classrooms, and in those classrooms we have chairs and desks, and something happens that the chairs in the classroom, too many of them are broken, and we realize we need new chairs. How many people in that classroom can build a new chair from scratch? And I asked students out loud, who thinks they could build a chair? Now, of course, there's some people that sometimes can build a chair. I've had some sort of people who have that skill, but more often than not, the sort of half-raised hands come from people who are just slightly arrogant enough to think, if I take a crack at it, I can build a chair. Most people sort of realistically understand that they don't possess the skills required to provide for themselves in the way that people once perhaps understood how to provide from themselves. And what we did was we specialized, right? And we created this sort of special, this is what always happens. There are special classes of people that fill the needs that we no longer can provide for ourselves. And we've been caught in a little bit of a trap in specialization, in that the more that we've become specialized, and there's a flip side to this I'll get to in a second, the more we've become specialized, the less empowered we are to do a broad variety of things in our lives. And so Durkheim, for example, talks about this. I always get these confused, mechanical solidarity versus organic solidarity. And at any rate, Durkheim talks about this and says that our solidarity in these specialized societies comes from the fact that we recognize we all need each other, is that we can't do all of these things any longer. And so we begin to rely on that person who can build your chair, or take you to the hospital in an ambulance and keep you alive. But we are coming to this interesting sort of crossroads where we can broadly access things and learn things and do things. The GPS allows us to go wherever we are. We don't need the cartographer anymore. The cartographer is in the phone, and this kind of thing is, the specialization's been replaced by these sort of enhancements that we have, and they've changed us as people. And I think, sort of as I said at the beginning, one of the things that we can do for students is sort of raise the idea that, what are you empowered to do? What are you capable of doing, and what are you not? And how do you feel about that? And then begin to address it with certain kinds of activities, perhaps. Marshall McLuhan, who I mentioned at the beginning, co-authored a book with two other authors. It might have been his son, Eric, and a woman by the name, I think, of Catherine Hutchinson, who was a school teacher. He wrote the book called City as Classroom. Mm-hmm. And it starts off by asking, what are you doing sitting there in that desk? And then proceeds to offer students a number of different kind of questions and explorations that they can do outside of the classroom environment by being out in their communities. And I think that sort of experiential learning idea that that everybody's sort of hot for does possibly provide some of the answers in that respect, is that we're married to the environments that we're teaching in because they're legacy environments. And so understanding which part of those legacy environments we need to preserve things we still value, like face-to-face communication, like listening skills and dialogue and co-creation and this kind of thing are important. But to, do things like what you're doing right now, where we're sort of online and we're engaging online in this way. And I assume you have other kinds of tasks and activities that you submit online, or you engage in online, or, you go out into the field and do some sort of research and come back and do an activity related to it. I mean, I do think that that's part of how we solve those problems. But we have to, as I said, we have to understand them first. If you know that you don't remember how to go from place A to place B without your GPS anymore, that's a problem to address with some sort of pedagogy, right? It's like, okay, how do we address this situation? And, I don't want to go on too long about it because I could really start to ramble on this, but my kids are dual citizens, Japan and the United States. And for a number of years, we've gone back in the summertime, and they've entered the elementary school system for 2 or 3 weeks to keep fresh and so forth. And I was really impressed with what an activity they did in Tokyo at their school, where they'd send the kids out on a number of different occasions to go map their communities, not only drawing maps of the geography, but also encountering people and connecting person A to person B. And it was a sort of a social studies exercise that they integrated other sorts of skills, reading and writing, and other sorts of things as well. But I thought that was a really brilliant way to deal with the problem of relying on a GPS and being on autopilot all the time.
Right. And I think that's key, is changing it and not being on autopilot. And, you know, that is something that we worry about in my school, because some teachers are going on autopilot. They don't like change.
Yeah.
Change is challenging, you know, and it's more challenging for others than it is for some. And I think it's going to take some time, but there is definitely, it's the landscape is changing. I think, thank you for your.
Yeah, thank you. I think there's an appetite definitely for broader thinking about what's possible. One of the things that I think about pretty frequently, and it's not a new idea, it's actually quite an old idea, is if we value living in democratic societies, where is it that we learn to practice democracy? It doesn't exist in any environment where we can, you know, the laboratory of democracy, where is it? And I'm striving to, in theory, I'm hoping to create more democratic environments in terms of like designing syllabi and empowering students to choose what activity they'd rather do, or which priorities they'd like to have, or which values they'd like to explore more in the classroom, and this kind of thing. I think that ranges from, sort of the primary level all the way through doctoral education, postdoctoral. I mean, right? It's like, where do we practice these kind of things, and how do we get good at them? Part of that is understanding the nature of the environment itself, and then building our activities and our environments to mirror them better.
Okay, very interesting discussion. So I just want to go back to this last topic of regulating access to, or the use of certain technology, as cell phones and etc. And also the connection with the ethical issues, like why are we supposed to tell people who don't have access to certain information now that they cannot use a tool that is designed to help them have access to that information? But maybe just to wrap up what we have been discussing, Professor Plug and Brother Thomas, I would like you to try to help us take one or two basic ideas that will help us with our projects. As you probably know, our students are working on projects where they have to design a project for educators, for teachers, in which we are going to help them understand the use of 3 technologies, but at the same time, how to deal with a particular issue such as identity theft or digital divide, etc. So it would be nice if you can really help us infuse 1 or 2 ideas into those projects. I don't know, Brother Thomas? Okay, yes, Brother Thomas.
I mean, as a white male in the United States, I know that provides me with certain status that not everybody in this country has. I did nothing to earn either of those characteristics, but it is part of who I am. And one of the points that I would raise in response to your question there is to invite all on the call to assess their underlying biases about themselves. And and to realize in their interactions with students in the classroom or students in a virtual classroom that you bring to the table who you are. And you need to be able to accept the fact that the other people around the table might find that strange, bizarre, off-putting, or distressing. And to be aware enough of yourself and open enough to the others. Again, it goes back to the Lassallean piece about inclusivity, to be conscious of avoiding writing into the code anything that would denigrate another person. So that's one thought that I would share.
Thank you, Brother Thomas. Okay, Dr. Plug.
Yeah, I think Brother Thomas was interestingly sort of connecting the question to a broader concern, which I think is important. And I tried to do that a little today at times too. And I think I teach a course in, what's the name of the course? The actual name of the course is Ethics in Mass Communication or something. It's actually a terrible name for the course, but we do ethics in public communication, ethics in media as sort of the core of the course. And the principal author of the text we use is a guy named Clifford Christians, who's quite an interesting scholar of ethics. And the latest textbook that he's produced in a long series of ethics textbooks is called Ethics in Public Communication, and it's about communitarian ethics. And I think one of the things that we need to embrace as we're using these kinds of tools now to design curricula and give advice to teachers who are designing curricula with those tools is Enlightenment ethics. The ethics of the autonomous individual have served us very well for a very long time. They're the basis for our democracy and a whole host of other important values like duty and virtue and so forth. And we ought not throw those away, but that given the nature of our culture, given the nature of the way that we're psychologically and socially organized, perhaps broadening the range of ethical considerations to include traditions prior to the Enlightenment and outside that sort of Eurocentric philosophical frame is important. And they suggest communitarian ethics and its emphasis on things like mutuality, on genuine dialogue. He talks about Paulo Freire, he talks about Martin Buber and a host of other people, and recognizing yourself in the other and vice versa. Some of the values that are implied in that orientation are that goodness comes not from the self, but from the space between selves. And it's natural for us to talk about those things in a communication department, in a communication context. But I think that from an education point of view, using tools that connect people, that have the potential to connect people in a really personal way across great distance and across a great variety of experiences, the first thing to keep in mind is how is what I'm designing raising people's voices so they can be heard? And how is the environment in which we're doing this centered around authentic listening, particularly for those people who have privilege in the environment or who have privilege in a broader environment as well? I think those are fundamental questions. And if our technologies don't do anything to promote those values, then they're useless to us, I think. Then they become our playthings. They become distractions and so forth. If you ask the question of any technology, is this technology increasing goodness among people? And you cannot answer yes, or you answer to the contrary, then that technology ought to be expunged from our experience, I think. It's an important question to ask. And I think that's the question in engaging with tools of pedagogy, particularly in online environments, we have to be most conscious of.
Thank you so much. Well, I don't know if any of you guys have any more question or comments, because if not, then that would be it for tonight. Brother Thomas, thank you so much for your contribution, for your time. I'm sure.
My pleasure. I enjoyed it.
Take away from you the Lasallian perspective and also all your ideas that complemented what Professor Platt was saying. And Professor Platt, thanks a million. I'm sure we had lots of food for thought so that our projects really fulfill and answer those last questions that you just mentioned. So thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. It was really a pleasure to be with all of you. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you guys.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Bye.
Thank
Right.
Sure. Okay. Is there any question you guys want to make about the project, or is everything okay? Alba, Laura, Alejandra, Carolina. Is everything okay with the projects? I try to answer some of the emails, but I don't know. Is everything okay with the projects?
Yes, I guess.
Professor,
I have a question.
yes.
This is the last stage, the one that is coming from this weekend.
Now remember that we're gonna move the design of our ideas into Google.
Yes.
That's the last thing. So so far, what you have been doing is designing. You have just made a map of a project with different units and parts and technology, etc. But we don't have the actual product, and that's what we need to take away from it. So Professor Shona and I will be checking your products and your proposals this weekend, and if we feel that everything is okay, you will be then ready to move on to the last 2 weeks. And basically that these 2 last weeks, it's putting your ideas into Google, finding ways to make them look as concrete technological or environments where teachers would have the opportunity not only to learn about how to use technology, the 3 technologies you have decided, but also to reflect on those topics that you were assigned. Now, based on what we had this evening, the interesting idea is how to make sure that those activities or those projects that we designed are giving teachers or participants really opportunities for them to raise their own voices. In other words, how are we helping them become aware of the issue that we were assigned, let's say identity theft, and how that is going to be reflected in their professional lives. And on the other hand, whether or not what we are planning, designing, is really opening space for them to listen to others, for them to really have the opportunity to interact from others. Because as you notice, Professor Pla was insisting on the idea that we have access to information, that we nowadays are maybe living a society that believes information is a right, but the thing is, how are we really helping ourselves and others to guarantee that we listen to what others have to say, so that by listening, we really can construct useful and information. So to answer your question, Laura, the next 2 weeks are, you are done with design, and now we'll move on to, particularly Shona's students will help us with the design of the Google Sites. We'll be more in charge of helping with translation into Spanish, maybe helping with some ideas, but that as they are designers, they will be leading that part.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that
that.
yeah, Google Sites is a very simple tool if you have already explored it, but it has some very interesting ideas of how to combine things, text with audio, and audio with our voices and sounds, etc., and video. So Shona and I wonder how we can make these very interesting projects that we have read so far in print, how now we're going to move those into virtual environments.
Okay.
But for that, we're going to have 2 weeks, starting next Monday.
Teacher, I have a question. Are we only going to use Google Sites? Is that the only resource?
Yes, thank you for the question. Shona and I were asked if Google Sites was the only option. No, Google Sites is the option we recommend. But for example, a group proposed another website, I think it was Wix, and there are others trying to find websites that provide them with more tools. So the idea is, yes, to make sure that whatever the option we choose in the groups, we guarantee that there is the possibility of combining different kinds of text, as I just said, voices, sounds, videos, etc., and that we guarantee that the website will be up for some time, because it would be very disappointing to come up with a very hard work and then 1 year later the website or the people in charge of the company closes down, and then you lose all that hard work. So we believe Google Sites offer us some advantages, because it seems they will be up for more years to come, but at the same time, because they have integrated different apps and tools. whereas other websites don't. They have the place where you upload things, but then you don't have the tools to make sure, for example, that you can upload a file or that you can create a Google form, etc., etc. But it's not mandatory, Alba. If you want to use another website that you know more, that you feel more comfortable with, you can do so, as long as it is a website that is used in both countries. Google Sites is used in both countries. That was why we made that decision.
Teacher, that is one of my questions. It's because I am not quite sure what is the idea of English and Spanish.
Remember that our course, it's not only in English. It's the project that we sent you, that Shona presented a month ago, and that she again insisted last 15 days ago, is that it's a dual project. We don't want English to be the dominant language. As a matter of fact, it is our means of communication. It's the means of interacting with our fellow classmates from Manhattan College. But we also need to understand that we need to provide the Spanish-speaking community with some of the things that we have learned. If we just have the English version, then we will be limiting ourselves and our communities. And just to finally answer your question, it also has to do with what Brother Thomas was saying about one of the principles that the Lasallian schools try to promote, and it's this idea of inclusive communities. If we only have it in English, then our community will not be inclusive.
Teacher, are we presenting the Google Sites both in English and Spanish?
The group, not just you. The group, you will have 2 weeks for the group to develop and to create a Google site that has 2 versions. Now, notice that Google Sites, some websites, they offer the English and the Spanish version simultaneously, as it happens with Moodle. So you don't have to be concerned so much with, does it really have to be everything in English or in Spanish? No, it's just, for instance, that you can provide instructions in English and then Spanish. It's not necessarily 2 different Google Sites. That's what I'm trying to say. But that in the space that you design, where you're designing one of the sessions, we have instructions and some indications in English, and then instructions and the same indications in Spanish. That is a dual website. Do you see my point? So it's not that you need to develop 2 Google Sites. It's the same Google site, but one part in English, one part in Spanish, and so on and so forth. So don't think about this as 2 independent Google sites. One that has everything in English, and then you have to do the same in Spanish. No, it's the same Google site, but English in one section, and then below it, Spanish, or vice versa. If you want to do it like that, English and Spanish, or Spanish and English, or even better, English and Spanish at the same level.
I have a final question.
Yes, Laura, please,
teacher,
go ahead.
And it's related to the project presentation. We are going to present the project with our groups in New York, right?
Yes,
the Manhattan
on Monday.
College. When we went
on Monday the 15th.
Class.
Yes. Yes, remember that
but we
have
presentation.
You're going to have from 4:30 to 6:30, you will have the time to prepare, to rehearse, to ask questions to Shona and I, because we'll be there with you guys. And the same, and then from 6:30 to 8:30, the different groups will have around 10-15 minutes to share your project, because so far only Shona and I know what you guys are doing. The others don't have any clue. The idea is that you're going to present, you're going to explain your choices, and you're going to make others understand what is the nature and the scope of what you proposed. So it's not, you don't have to see this like a thesis defense or something. This is not a defense. You're just simply presenting, or what we call here in Colombia, you're having a socialization of your project. You're basically describing what you did and showing us what you did, how you did it, how it looks, etc., etc.
Okay.
So
thank you.
But just to make sure, Laura, that we are on the same page, that Monday the 15th, sorry, April the 15th, from 4:30 to 8:30 will be online or there physically working on our projects and then sharing the projects with our classmates. Now, there are other people who will be with us. There are some Lasallian brothers who will be attending the session, people from other programs who want to just listen to you and to me, to us, to understand what we did, because they are really interested in this project. To them, that's why, for example, we had brother Thomas. Brother Thomas is a very important brother in the Lasallian scale in New York, in the United States, sorry. And he and others are really interested in what we're doing. And Sean and I are very proud to let them see what you have been working on, because believe me, the ideas and the projects you are coming up, wow, are really interesting, and they really show that that the message has resonated. In other words, that we are now more aware about ethical issues, that we're more about global issues, but at the same time that we understand that it is our moral responsibility, our ethical responsibility to share what we are learning in this course with others. And we love that idea because it's part of the Lasallian trademark.
Yeah. Okay, teacher.
Okay?
Okay.
Okay, thank you, Laura. Yes, Carlina.
Yes. So I got your email, the comments, and I think we're a little bit more clear about the technologies. But now I'm wondering, since you were talking about that the technology should be in Spanish and English, I just realized that one, or not necessarily.
No, the technologies. What must be in Spanish and English is what the content of what you're doing in each section.
Okay.
That's
all right. No, so everything Spanish. Okay, yeah, because because we have Quizlet, which has the 2 options, but the other one of them don't.
Yeah.
And I was like,
it doesn't. But it doesn't matter.
Okay.
It doesn't matter because, as I explained to Alba, it's not the technology itself, but it's what you want to the audience to do through that technology.
Okay, so as long as we provide them with some maybe instructions on how to use them in Spanish,
and English,
they should be fine. It's not like we have
yes, that's okay. The second one is the Thing Link, right?
Yeah, yes, which I loved.
Yeah, very. I was very interested because we were using Glip, if you remember, Glipgrid, which is similar, but I love this one a lot more.
Yeah. So yeah. Okay. Great.
Anyway, Sean and I will be providing you with some further feedback tomorrow, Friday, and Saturday and Sunday. But don't worry, what we have seen, it's really, really interesting, and it's really what we wanted you to be able to come out with out of this experience.
Okay.
So thank you so much, Alba, Laura, Carlina, Alejandra. I think she's still online. If there are no more questions, thank you for your time. We'll be in touch through our Moodle.
Okay. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Have a good night.
Bye. You too.
Bye. Thank
Bye-bye.
you.